right, thank you for sticking around. We're going to start the next presentation, how to share your data for research and who owns what. James O'Leary is the Chief Innovation Officer with Genetic Alliance, and I'm going to turn it right over to him. Again, if you want to ask questions during, I have a microphone, and just raise your hand and I'll definitely come by and make sure to get it to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And yes, if you have questions during the presentation, go ahead, raise your hand. I want this to be interactive. There is a fair amount of kind of overlap in our topics, but we did talk ahead of time, so I'm going to try and build on some of Liz's points and then also expand on that. But I'm happy to kind of tailor this where you want it to go. So I work at Genetic Alliance. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Genetic Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on engaging individuals, families, and communities to transform health. And we do that in a number of areas. We work on translational research programs. We work on access to services with individuals with genetic conditions. And we also work on maternal and child health, specifically newborn screening, and also prenatal testing. So we have a broad range of projects and programs. And actually, I do some work around this topic, but I do a lot of work around tools and platforms to help people access information about diseases, about clinical trials, about information education and support organizations. I do a lot of work around public health screening. So I'm going to kind of touch on the wide world of data and the different uses of it, as well as data for clinical trials and basic science research. So what data are we talking about? This is a really important question because when people say they want data or people should contribute data, I mean, that can mean a million different things. And as was said earlier, depending on the outcome you want, the type of data you want is very different. And so just kind of going out and starting to collect data all over the place is not necessarily a good use of your time. Instead, you want to first kind of put together a strategic plan, maybe a short-term strategic plan and a long-term strategic plan to say, what kind of outcomes do I want to see, and then consult with partners on what kind of data would result in those outcomes. So you all deal with all this type of data. I mean, there's online data in terms of, how you behave online, what websites you visit, literacy of what users of your websites, for instance, data analytics for who's visiting. All of that data is very useful to your organization, but it's very different than medical data. There's medical data from electronic health records. There's patient-reported outcomes data, which in many cases is used very differently than clinical data. There's biological samples of all different types, as Liz mentioned. There's genetic and genomic data, sequencing data, but also genetic testing results. There's device data, increasingly, whether that's from your iPhone or that's from a medical, like an implanted medical device. That's increasingly important, but in many ways unregulated type of data. There's public health data from screening programs, from public health agencies that's collected from healthcare providers. There's registry data, which could be a registry from a university, an academic researcher, from a disease organization, from state cancer registries. There's a lot of data out there that's being collected, not just through kind of standard research registries. And then there's certainly clinical trials data as well, both information from successful studies that then becomes part of the application for a drug to FDA, but then also a lot of data around failed studies as well, which is also useful. So one of the big things that I want to talk about today is ownership versus control versus privacy. And I'm going to talk about this from the individual perspective and then also from the organizational perspective, because I think both are important and will set you up for Meg's talk and also for Liz's talk for kind of organizational strategy tomorrow. Um, we talk a lot about privacy in this country, and privacy is really important. You don't want people spying on your medical information. You don't want people having easy access to your information. And a lot of people will say, oh, privacy is dead. I've heard so many people say that at talks. I'm really over it. Especially in the healthcare space, for years, people just kept saying privacy is dead, privacy is dead. I mean, that is not actually true. What's true is your information is out there. It's in a lot of different places, and you don't have control over it. But your next door neighbor probably can't access easily your buying history from CVS. They probably can't see your prescription data, which you probably don't want. Its ease of access is also important in privacy. Also important is control. This idea of, do you have control over where your data is going? Both in an initial agreement, so a consent form, for instance, but also ongoing control. Once you give up rights to your data, is there a way to pull that back? Is there a way to or increase later? I mean, many individuals, after they get a diagnosis for a serious condition, would want to open up their sharing preferences. And is there a way to do that? A great example was research studies too, where, initially, maybe you didn't want the results returned. But then once you start going through a trial, you really want access to that data and you can't get it. The third area is this idea of ownership. And ownership matters from the individual standpoint in terms of rights to that data, but it also matters on the organizational perspective because ownership of data can mean leverage for your organization to drive researchers to work on your condition. It can mean to share information beyond an initial partnership to other researchers worldwide. It can mean incentives too. I mean, giving ownership or sharing ownership can be a very strong incentive for people to work with you because samples, for instance, we heard, are valuable. So they have a value, so they are a currency in some ways. So these three concepts are different, related, but all very important. So what does that mean for this idea of then contributing and getting this data out where it needs to be? Because that's what we all want, right? We not only want the right data collected, but we want to get it places where it's useful. I feel the same way about money. In public health, for instance, I do a lot of work in public health. People are very scared of money. They don't want to talk about money like it's evil, like this is evil, dark force over here, money that ruins everything. Money is energy. I mean, you want the energy to be in the right place. And if it's in the right place, it can do a lot of good. If it's in the wrong place, then you're missing out on real opportunities. And so same with data. How can we get that data in the right place so it's not doing harm? In fact, that data is generating good. So let's look at these individually. We already talked about some of these. But it's good to have, I think, a basic understanding of where these things flow. So we talked about medical records and that you have the right to access your medical records, though your provider has the right to charge you a reasonable fee and also I think they have up to 30 days to return the record. So that right there is already a challenge. But also, what is your medical record? What information is included within that? And how is that data presented? I mean, are they going to give you a printout of your medical record, and how useful is that to you? If you're going to see a new doctor or you want to look up something specific, yeah, maybe that's useful. If you want to use it for a research study, that might not be very useful. So one thing that's changing a lot in this space is electronic health records. So there's a huge, huge shift in the number of providers using electronic health records in the last few years due to federal incentives, which I won't go into detail on. But one of the things that's happening is a lot of the data in electronic health records is becoming more structured. So it's not all freehand text, which is pretty much useless for research studies. So we talked about that earlier. If data isn't collected in a way towards a certain purpose, many times it winds up being useless because you miss important data points. it wasn't collected properly, or there isn't even enough context around how it was collected for it to be used in a controlled study. But one step in the right direction is that a lot more of that data could be structured. So Meg works on family health history a lot, which is an excellent example of this. Healthcare is increasingly not family-centered. People don't see the same doctor, your records aren't connected. Family health history data has always been a really big challenge in this space of how do you take a pedigree, for instance, that's a paper form buried in a folder in your record, and then turn that into a useful piece of data for maybe an epidemiological study. So that space is changing. One of the big fights that I think we're going to have in this room is this idea around your record being able to be shared in a structured way. So maybe that's health information exchanges. So sharing your information between your doctors, that you just have one record with all your specialists and your primary care providers and not 8 different records. And also getting that information out of your health system you're in and maybe into the hands of a researcher. And so there will be policy coming down the pike on that, I am quite sure, because it's just not happening to the degree that I think all of us want it to. The second area is device data. This area is largely unregulated, so if it's a actually approved medical device, that data has to go to your provider in a summary form, not the raw data, at least as far as I understand the current landscape. If it's like your iPhone or it goes to a company, though, it's going to depend on the user agreement. So you would have to read all that legalese and find out what rights do you have to that data that's being collected. Maybe it's a running app that you have, or maybe it's something that measures your heart rate or something like that. And increasingly, there's going to be more and more and more and more of those types of medical devices that aren't approved medical devices. So they're not necessarily going through the FDA, for instance. And so there's going to be less controls over them. Also, biological samples. Are you talking about Havasupai at all? Okay. So one of the interesting, and genomic samples. So one of the interesting things that we talked about is, and was mentioned in the earlier session, was partnering with universities, for instance. Many advocacy groups have amazingly successful partnerships with academic researchers. But sometimes you have to be really careful about controlling who has the rights to data and who has the rights to biological samples, especially biological samples, because they're a limited valuable resource. Someone was saying they worked with a group and then that group wouldn't share any of their information or data. And it was commented that people should, by Meg, that people should, on the front end, build that into their contracts or their licensing agreements or what have you. One of the reasons that's really, really important and really important to understand is that the researcher, that individual, might not know what their university's policies are. So you could be working with the best, most bleeding heart activist researcher possible, and they might tell you that yes, of course I'll give access to these samples to anyone, but that person might later be blocked by their university and their university's policies. So don't take things for granted in that regard. Similarly, a lot of times from the individual level, sharing samples can also be governed by university policies. So there's this famous case with the Havasupai tribe, which is in the Grand Canyon, who researchers partnered with the tribe to do studies around diabetes. And the tribe was, has very high rates of diabetes. They were very interested in this question. The samples were collected. They were put in a freezer. Or maybe I think they were blood samples. And later, another researcher took those same samples and did ancestry studies on those samples that in some ways contradicted the origin stories of the tribe. The tribe didn't agree to that. I mean, they really wanted to be involved in the diabetes study. Their understanding with the researcher was that those samples would be used for that purpose. But the university had full rights to use them for whatever purposes they wanted to. So the tribe actually sued the university, and they wound up settling out of court, so there's no precedence, a legal precedence for who has the rights. But they did wind up getting the samples back and also receiving a settlement from the university. So this space is changing and evolving, but it is important to know your rights and to also kind of a gentleman's agreement isn't necessarily going to cut it in this space, and to know that going in. And then, same with a lot of the online behavior. So increasingly, a lot of you work with communities where there might be some really, really valuable information on symptoms or disease progression that's coming out in forums, for instance, that you run. That's really valuable data. And it is important to communicate to your members, or if you're an individual participating in those forums, to understand the terms of service and what's going to happen to that information. Is that private information? Is that a public forum? Is your name going to be connected to that information? Is it an anonymous forum? Those things are important. Not necessarily because there's a right answer, but because transparency is very important. Because trust in this space is as or more important than privacy. Question over there?
I'm going to give you the mic.
Speaking of family genomic testing and trust and reality, my daughter was at the Mayo Clinic and they were doing a study on family genetic issue. Went back 7 generations. She neglected, because she was so impacted by the information, to get a copy of it at the time. And now she can't get them to answer her. And those are absolutely her records. I mean, we can hire a lawyer, but if you're talking about trust and transparency, boom, that's not how it's working.
Right. And I think this is an issue from both ends too, which is our research system is not set up to be centered on individuals and families and their needs. And that is an ongoing problem, because the researcher, for instance, might have, if they're a clinical researcher even, they might have a grant to focus on this a certain number of time. Maybe they have a research assistant. Maybe that research assistant then left because the grant money ran out. Or maybe they have an IRB protocol where they can give it back at that point in time and not again. Or maybe they're just ignoring you. And so, but all of those things mean that the system isn't built for the participants. It's built for the research institution. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some areas where they're trying to change that. We heard a lot about PCORI today, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And some of their research networks are trying to really look at how protocols can be patient-centered from the beginning, bring in patients. Actually, at Genetic Science, we try not to use the word patient, but there's no great word, but individuals and families into the process early to design and answer these questions, because having experts, you want to have all the experts, and one of them are the participants and partners in the study. Another great example of this, I think, that everyone's very familiar with, if anyone's read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and that is a fascinating read around this idea of who controls biological samples. Okay, but then the practical, right? Rubber meets the road. You're an individual, you want to contribute your information, or you're an organization, you want to get access to it. So Liz talked about ways to get electronic health records. And increasingly, there will be more ways to collect that information in a more kind of coherent way. In large healthcare systems, they already have or are building ways to collect electronic health record information and use it for research studies. Many do. So children's hospitals, for instance, many of them are involved in something called PedsNet, which is actually partially funded by PCORI, which is this network of pediatric hospitals that do research studies. And a lot of those studies are either research studies or quality improvement initiatives that use electronic health record data in the studies. Those systems are built to do both the clinical utility and also for research purposes. And we'll increasingly see that being the case. Those frequently, though, are all built to be used within that one healthcare system, usually not have that data be shared. There's increasing examples of that, but that is something that is happening, and the more outside groups that push for access to the data, the more instances of groups like the one Liz Horn is working with, asking for that information, I think the more you'll see tools and resources to do that. Test results. There was an executive order, and now I have no sense of time anymore. I think it was 2014, that individuals have access to their test results directly from the lab if they request them. There's still a lot of enforcement questions that are actually currently being answered. Some have come out recently, but it is now an individual's right to access their test results. So what we're seeing actually is a lot of movement, especially from sequencing labs, for instance, to try and figure out how are they going to return those results. There's a couple good things about this. One, on the clinical side, what you're seeing is reports that are both patient-friendly and provider-friendly, which I think should be the same thing because, frankly, everyone should have accessible information, and it's not that different for an individual than it is for a provider. But on the lab side, they're also looking at how to provide lab test results back in an online format and to give context to that information. So as an organization, if you want to have individuals, members request lab results, increasingly they're able to do that, and increasingly they'll be able to do that too, also using online forms and online access to those results. Device data, as I mentioned, that space is still changing, and it's really based on user agreements, or you have to get it through the provider, and that doesn't always wind up in the electronic health record, so it can be very difficult. And then registry data we talked about, and research study data and the return of that we also talked about. Okay, so I want to do a little audience participation here. So this is a survey question that we're asking. Genetic Alliance is about to release a survey for individuals with genetic conditions, looking at access to and quality of care, and we're hoping it will be a very large survey and drive some of the kind of strategic visioning that's going on in the community around how to deliver genetic services. So this is one of the questions, though, that some of our staff put in. What factors would impact your decision to participate in a registry? So I want to give a hypothetical registry. So let's say there's a registry that someone's working on here specifically looking at diet. And they're signing people up outside, and they want you to contribute kind of your basic medical history information, your contact information to this registry, and then track your eating habits over a certain amount of time. So, and that's, it's just someone outside at a table, let's say, but they want your medical history information. Personally, if you look through this list, I'm curious, what is the number one factor that would impact your ability or your willingness to participate in that registry? So, okay, so everyone think about this. Everyone get an answer in your mind. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. So, but you have to pick first. I don't want you influenced by those around you. Okay. Right, okay, there we go. Okay, so who said knowing my information will be kept safe? One, okay. How about privacy? The privacy information is explained in lay terms, and we actually got rid of that word lay in the final survey. Okay, how about who the information is shared with? Okay, great. What the information will be used for? Okay. Types of the information collected. In this case, I gave you some examples. Okay. Who owns the registry? Okay. The anonymity of your samples? Okay. And then whether, so this one too changed updatability, meaning like, can you change your answers later and on an ongoing way? Okay, and then what about others in my community who are enrolling in the registry? So you kind of follow the lead of other people you trust. Okay, so I think what we found there is certain people care to some degree about privacy and protection of their information. There were some people that said anonymity, there were some people that said privacy, but most of it is either who gets that information or what it's going to be used for. And I'm going to talk about both of those examples when I do are we at 30? Okay, great. So I'm going to actually move forward to showing you an example of peer that will, I hope, elucidate some of these issues around a genetic alliance platform, registry platform. Okay, so just to say, I think Liz is going to touch on these tomorrow. There's a lot of ways to use your data too as an organization. You heard about a lot of these today. Is it patient-focused drug development and risk-benefit analysis? Is it basic science research? Is it understanding the disease progression, prevalence? Is it clinical trials? Having a list of individuals for clinical trials and enrolling people in trials? Is it kind of pre-post market analysis to get people interested in your disease and to understand how big the population is and how to reach them? Is it service delivery, quality of services, uptake of services? Are people using drugs? What are the biggest issues with using existing treatments? Or is it screening and testing? As we mentioned, there's a lot of variants of uncertain significance with whole genome sequencing. There's a lot of tests that the quality information isn't out there. Those could be extremely important to your condition. So kind of prioritizing these areas is important. Okay, so let's go to peer. So peer is a platform that currently focuses on self-reported clinical data of individuals participating. It also allows individuals to set their own sharing, privacy, and data access preferences in a granular and dynamic manner. And dynamic means they can change them ongoing. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means. But this is really, really, really important. So we don't use consent. We do use a consent on the front end because we have to for a lot of studies, which you click through. We're trying to replace consent with allowing people to set their own data sharing preferences. So they get to choose where their data goes. That even means that we work with over 50 community organizations that use peer as their registry platform. But rather than leaving, once you sign a generic consent, it's to the organization to decide where that data goes, it's on the individual to decide. Now, usually they share that information, of course, with the advocacy organization, but they also might want to share it with other people, other research studies and other organizations. And we fundamentally believe that individuals should have the right to control their data and where it goes. We also use community-based guides to help people set those preferences. And it's a platform, it's what we call a white label platform. And what that means is it's not Genetic Alliance branded. It is across all diseases, the system, and all 50 communities use it. All people go into one registry. But those individuals set who gets access to their data. So it's one platform. And people can brand it however they want. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like in a second. So just to give you some numbers, there's a lot of communities, almost all disease advocacy organization communities that are funded as part of PCORI, something called the Patient-Powered Research Networks. We are a coordinating center for that project. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funds us to 30 communities, some disease advocacy groups. There's also a midwife group, and all sorts of other community organizations. There are also some overarching campaigns that use this platform. Free the Data helps get access to BRCA variants, which are we're currently controlled largely, the data for that test was controlled by one company. And so we are trying to free that data up so it can be used by everyone. And then some other specific advocacy partnerships that are not working with us through a grant, but actually just using the registry platform, which I think I asked them this morning, what's the initial fee around using the platform, and I think it's about $10,000. So I'll skip by this one. So basically, though, this concept of letting individuals set their privacy preferences is based upon this study. So most people, as we heard earlier, want to share their information for research. We also heard earlier from Meg, most people want to be asked. But there's also some people that don't want it open. They want to be asked on an individual project basis. And actually, we had a lot of people that raised their hand for that said they want to know what it's being used for. So the technology is out there to do that, right? I mean, you do that all the time on your web accounts, where you can they can ping you, send you an email, send you a text message to ask you, oh, are you interested in this offer? So, I mean, we can do that. But it's never really been done before on a broad scale in research. And so that's essentially what we did, partnering in a public-private partnership with a company called Private Access. And it allows you to accept a study, to decline, or to hit wait to come back to it. But essentially, we're putting the flexibility in the hands of the person. So the way that this essentially works is that there's a platform, a tool, which I'm going to show you in a second, for people to answer registry-based questions, so validated questions that are determined by the community in question. There's a privacy layer that they set their privacy settings, and then there's a way to query the data in the system. So the query for the data not only allows you to ping privacy data, the privacy directives, but then also to access contact information, to contact people and access data. So I'll go through this really quick. So an organization, for instance, let's say a disease advocacy organization, sets up a portal with community guides, chooses their research questions. We have a database of validated questions to choose from, but then also they work with maybe their research advisory board to determine, or a researcher to come up with the questions that they'll use in their registry system. They'll disseminate that portal out to their community, and then individuals will go in and set their individual privacy preferences using privacy layer. There's actually 3 levels of privacy directives. It's to see your information, to download your data, and then also to contact you individually. And you actually set, yes, no, or ask me for all of those. And the way that I'll go through a little bit how the guides work to make this a lot easier. Then, once you're in the system, you go in and actually answer these questions on a gamified survey, which means that you can see how other people also responded to questions. And that data gets captured in this cross-disease registry. Then data seekers will ping that, but in between them and seeing the health data, there are your privacy directives and your contact directives. The data seeker might say, I'm doing a breast cancer research study. For everyone that gave access for breast cancer studies or to that researcher as a yes, they'll have access. For everyone that said, ask me, then they can contact them through the system. It will ping the person and say, this is for a breast cancer study. Here's the study. This is a validated researcher in our system. Yes, no, or wait. What we found is that people that use this system, nearly 90% of all respondents reported a high degree of trust in how their personal information and peer would be handled. So this is just right after the registration process, that they say they feel that their information will be used how they want it to be used. This is just a closer look at the page where if you selected that you wanted to choose individually, you could do that, but you could also follow a community guide, and we use videos that explain that. And the way the community guides work, I think, is very interesting. It's not that the community guides will just tell you what they chose. They'll tell you what they would choose if they had high privacy concerns, medium, or low privacy concerns. And then you can see, and there are I think three or four guides that you can actually choose and see how different people would set their settings. And you can just say, I want to do it exactly like this person, or you can go in and individually choose based upon your own wishes. And you can change these over time. And these are just some examples of the guides. This is just an example of a gamified question where you can see the results after you answer the question. And then you can see from these portal examples that it's completely customizable based upon the community that wants to use it. And we actually have a really easy interface. You can change the colors, upload your own photos, upload badges, change the questions, and there's a whole interface that allows organizations to do that. So I just want to end by saying this is a question of trust in the research community. It is a two-way discussion of trust, or actually many, because there are many different partners here. It's individuals trusting the communities they're part of. It's individuals trusting researchers. It's trust between a partnership between advocacy organizations and researchers. But it's also researchers and advocacy organizations trusting people. It's about trusting that people want to participate in research and that they will be valuable partners in research. Not research people, not study participants, but partners. And that's a really important piece of this, is trusting people that they will give their data, they will participate, and that we don't need to use kind of subterfuge to try and get them involved in studies, that we don't need 80-page consent forms that people can't and don't read. We need to trust people that they want to partner with us on research, and I think that will fundamentally change the research enterprise. So what I would leave us with is place the person in the center of everything, and if we honor that guiding principle, then everything else will follow. And that's it.
And now we have plenty of time for questions. So if you just raise your hand, we'll tool around with the mic here.
Hi, you were talking about Peer as a platform. Are there any possibilities for like add-on modules or an API, like some kind of integration with other tools?
And when you say other tools, can you give me some examples? Like other registry platforms?
A registry, a PHR, or any kind of
Right.
visualization tool? Or
Yeah, so absolutely. So electronic health records we're working on right now. Actually, we're pretty close to pulling in for certain systems electronic health records. We're also working around storage of genomic data in a project right now. Certainly, the answer is absolutely. I mean, we're very interested in that. One of the examples that was given to, I think everyone saw Meg's, the Sage Bionetworks research kit, for instance, which focuses a lot on how to collect data. And I know we've been in discussions with them about how to integrate that tool so it feeds into the Peer registries as well. We've also used Peer on things like tablet PCs in clinics to actually get to people where they are at and not just ask them to do it online. And so, there's so much opportunity here. And this space this has been a space that I think that has eluded the community for a long time. And then suddenly now there's a lot of options. And so we're trying to build on resources and tools and build in modules as quickly as possible. There's a whole team at Genetic Alliance that works on this. I'm actually not even on that team. But I'm happy to connect you to them if you'd like. Great.
All right, one more question in front.
Thank you, it's Tom again. I really like your concept of letting the user manage their security level that they wish to implement, which to me reflects that there's really two security concerns, and that would be the authentication of the user themselves when they come in, and the proper handling of change management. Recording the, if someone comes in, makes an update or makes a change, that it gets logged appropriately. Is that,
Yes.
and that's all been addressed and being handled. How do you handle your user authentication?
The user authentication.
The user authentication.
Yeah. So I wish actually I could do this live, but it's the private access, the organization that the company that we've partnered with actually for many years now. They had brought in someone from, I think it was from Experian, and so they pretty much used the kind of 3-level authentication that's used in banking for users for the system. So one of the big concerns, though, with anything like that is we don't want people to have user fatigue, right? If we don't want people to get bumped out because they're not incentivized to get past the early stages. That, though, we really did try and copy what people are used to in a high privacy security thing like banking. And so we did follow that pretty closely. That's also a problem, though, just to slight tangent on the data entry level. And so what we've really tried to do is get people through the privacy settings as quickly as they want to get through. So a lot of the community guides, for instance, people will just say, well, this is the person I like, this is my level, click, I'm done, I like this, and I'll go back and change it later if I change my sensitivity to those. Then there's a small portion of users that will go in and do every single one. But most people will look at it on the broad scale and say, well, yes, I want to watch this video, maybe I'll watch a second video, I'll choose my level and select it. But does that answer your first question? Okay.
Any other questions?
I think one there.
I have a series of very short questions.
Sure.
Who owns your registry data? Does the advocacy group own it, or do you own it?
No, the individual owns it. So we can't access the registry data unless the individual chooses to share it with us.
Okay.
The group can't either, but I mean, they're coming through the group's portal, so almost every single person, and we can say that from the actual communities. I mean, nobody would be using registry with us if no one selected their community except that. And it's all of that community's guides. But if that individual later decides that they want to remove that permission, they can do that.
Okay, and do you reserve the right to add extra surveys across the board to registries that you think may
So
be
do we
applicable?
have a core set of questions,
Right.
meaning? So and the groups have control over their data questions. I mean, that create a portal with us.
Okay.
There's the kind of standard first set of questions that's agreed upon with the group, but then we also have a full database of questions that can populate to ask cross-disease questions if the individual wants to go on. And I'm trying to think, I don't think those are standard, but we might allow the individual to go in and just keep answering cross-disease questions if they want to, but they're never the first questions. So I'm trying to, I'd have to check with you on whether it's up to the user to go on to randomized cross-disease questions, or if we just do a hard cutoff.
So they are available
They are available.
if they want to take them, but they're not like
No.
enforced or whatever?
No.
Okay. And my last question is, have you ever initiated or considered or are able to import data from another registry platform? Like if we have a registry and we wanted to start using
Right.
your platform instead,
Right.
could we port our
So
data?
I will take your card and let me give that to the peer people in my group, because I know that they are looking right now about importing data, because they're importing some structured data from electronic health records. That's what they're working on. If they can do that, they should certainly be able to do it from another registry platform. I just don't know where they're at, and like if they can do it now or if that's going to be something in the future.
No, just a further elaboration on that point. I know that Sage BioNetworks is partnering with the Genetic Alliance so that the data that's collected on the Bridge research apps would be able to be directly ported over. So we're already collaborating on that.
Any other questions?
So I had a question from, this is really great, and I'm so glad you had the chance to, and the time to explain it to all of us. From a person that would be analyzing the data, how do they, can you talk a little bit more about how they become an approved researcher and kind of who makes that decision? And then, because again, it's always interesting, how are those decisions made and who can use the data? And then my second question is, we live in a world where people just don't have one condition. We all actually probably have multiple conditions. And as this grows and you get more common diseases, how does the research find someone that has heart disease and diabetes and high cholesterol?
So I'm going to reverse answer this question. So yes, comorbidities and people that have multiple conditions, that is a huge, huge reason why so the individual control and this being a cross-disease registry are both very important to the model. And the third being obviously the idea that you can bring the costs down if you have a shared research platform, which Genetic Alliance has been kind of trying to do that in a lot of different spaces for a long time. And it's great to see the success of this one because we learned a lot from our mistakes in the past. But that is really important, and what we're seeing too is that right now, because of the way we structured this, we're able to bring on communities that aren't disease specific, who have questions just like the ones you're asking. And so it is built for that. Now, the question's gonna be, well, what about for those that are already in the system and decide they might want to say, well, I'm interested in, sleep studies. Let's just say, and let's say some cross-section of 10% of people in all of peer say they're interested in sleep studies, which is great, great. We want those people to be involved in the research they're interested in. What about the questions that they've answered? So this is to your question, I think it's Rachel. So I think I just answered my own question because without having to ask them, which is, yes, if they come in through the portal, there's an initial set of questions, but then individuals can choose to go on and answer more questions. Or to be contacted, so those are registry questions, but they can also choose certainly to be contacted for other research studies. So a researcher could contact them and ask them if they'd like to be involved. Most of those studies are not currently, or all of those studies are not currently done through our system currently. So there's a registry through our system, registry questions, but people aren't actually doing research studies through our platform, if that makes sense. But I think that is certainly in the future something that could be done as the technology develops. The consent process is obviously different for that. You do need to consent a specific study through an IRB and then consent people for that study. So that's not what that platform does right now. But yes, that is the idea. Also, we want to create a culture of participation in research in this country, and it just doesn't exist right now. I mean, the number of people that participate in research is incredibly low. Less than, I think 5% is the statistic that most people cite for how many people are involved in research in their lives. That's terrible. So if we can even change this model up to get people interested in participating in research, whether they're, they're doing it for a specific condition or across conditions or for some service-based study, or maybe they're actually in the comparator arm of a clinical trial, great. If we can get that up to 10%, that would be that would double the number of people involved in research in this country, let alone if we get it up to what people say, which is that most people want to participate in research. The researcher validation question, I don't know the answer to it broadly. I know the answer to it through the communities that then are worked with to become approved researchers. But I'm not sure anyone outside of those, because we don't really do that right now, because we haven't hit the tipping point on the database yet, where the database is large enough for those types of studies, we really right now just focus on working with specific communities and their research questions. Say it again. Yeah, and the community with their, I mean, we have some requirements, like you have to have a medical advisory board, and yes. But yes, that's correct.
Other question?
Yeah, Cindy Luxoy-Han, I'm with the Alagille Syndrome Alliance, and I'm curious about how, if there's an organization like ours that wanted to set up a registry on the peer platform, is there a cost for that? Or is it available
Yes.
to
So
any
there's
organizations?
There's
or-
two answers to that. One is a lot of our communities come in through research grants that we've applied for, and then we open up to groups to apply and then cover the cost through the research grant. That's a lot of what we've done so far. But there are some groups that have already worked with us directly. And when I texted them earlier to say, how much does it cost now? Because we keep trying to bring the cost down. I think they said it's a $10,000 setup cost, which means that we don't work with you in developing your questionnaire, though. That's really important. But we will work with you to, your community guide, videos, setting up the platform, customizing the platform, all of our template and instructional documents, all of that stuff. And then I think there's an upkeep fee each year, which is much, much lower than that, but I'm not sure what the exact figure is.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.